Welcome all, I have CivilNet analyst Eric Hacopian here with me. Today we'll be discussing the topic of Armenian foreign policy. What's changing? Where are things heading? Pros and cons, ups and downs, and most importantly, what needs to be done? So Eric, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Eric, there has been a flurry of diplomatic activity as of late. Armenia's foreign minister is having more meetings with his counterparts around the world. Pashinyan has had meetings with Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev, a phone call with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. My first question is, however, for Armenia, why is a shrewd, proactive, diplomatic core so important, in your opinion?
Well, if you're a small, weak country, or relatively weak at this point, you need to have an above-average diplomatic corps. Because what do diplomats do? They do two things. They tell the country's story and they create relationships. And relationships and storytelling is far more relevant for smaller countries like Armenia, especially one surrounded by giant neighbors. So I think that's why it's important. As far as the what this hyperactivity at this point means is that it's actually a good thing, but it starts off from a very low base because we were in such a gigantic hole diplomatically, and we had neglected so many relationships for so long. I think they're making a very concerted effort. I'm not talking about the immediate negotiations with the Turkish regime or the regime in Baku. I'm talking about overall. I mean, the foreign minister is out of the country most of the time now, which is the way it should be, creating these, one-on-one relationships with primary countries in Europe, but also in other places in the Middle East. So I think it's a good thing, but obviously, to be truthful, our primary opponents actually have a much better diplomatic corps and have done a much better job of telling their story and creating relationships. And this is something where we need to do a lot of catch up, but it's a good sign that they're being active, but we need to put that in context that they're starting from a very low base.
And an important factor of the diplomatic sphere right now is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I want to talk about. The war is currently in a sort of stalemate, even though Russia has been making some gradual advances, taking the city of Lysychansk, for example. With state interests in mind, what should Armenia's approach be, its diplomatic approach be? What would be the best outcome for Armenia, and what should Armenia generally hope for in this regard?
The best outcome for Armenia, and in fact for most other smaller countries, is a quick end to this war, in whatever terms. Obviously, that's not how the primary parties see it. But the more uncertainty, the more stability in the world, it is a better world for smaller, weaker states. So our state interest is for a quick end to this war, no matter what that means. As far as what we could do about it, our ability to affect it is very limited. And I think the one thing that this government has actually done fairly well is to sort of thread the needle of not antagonizing Russia at the same time, not condoning the invasion.
And I mean, how do you think this war is going to end, Eric?
This war at this point will only end in two ways. One is a collapse of the Ukrainian army. Or two, and then obviously the United States and the West are doing everything to prevent that from happening. And two, some kind of a break in the Western front between different factions or countries, i.e. if a few Western European countries under economic pressure as we're heading into an energy crisis-driven deep recession in Western Europe, which is on the verge of bringing down multiple governments or creating great political upheaval, from the trucker strike in Holland to Draghi almost resigning in Italy or offering to resign. Boris Johnson was a different kind of story, but obviously he was affected by the poor economy. So I think it's either a total collapse of the Ukrainian army, which is not out of the question, but possible, but not likely. And the second one would be that the economic pain and the energy pain for Western Europe becomes too much, and they force an end to this war. But this is not a decision the Ukrainians are going to make, or it's not a decision they're going to make alone. They are so vested into the Western system, and this decision was probably going to be made in Washington.
And, when speaking about analysis regarding Armenia, a term that oftentimes comes up is red lines. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, what should Armenia's red lines be with regards to its relationship with Russia, but also with the West?
The red line with Russia is our basic freedoms and democracy. We do not want to live like slaves like some of our neighbors do to the east and west of us. That's our red line there. Our red line with the West is do not ask us to sacrifice our national security or the physical security of the Armenians of Artsakh and Armenia in general. Those are our red lines.
But there have been some diplomatic breakthroughs as of late. Pashinyan had a phone call with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a first. Ankara and Yerevan have agreed to open the land border for third-party citizens and also open the skies to air cargo transportation. Is this, in your mind, a success of Armenian diplomacy?
If it's a success, it's a very minor success. Because I think this is not a process that's driven by us. It's a process that's driven by international pressure or international events, or Turkey trying to, give a good impression to different parties in Europe specifically and the United States. But the air cargo thing, for example, is a good thing. Just overall, it's always a good thing to be able to have more cargo access and more access to your country. But overall, these are something that they're very rudimentary level. And I think the fact that they're on the rudimentary level speaks to the insincerity of the other side, because for all the conditions that they had set over 30 years about having relations in an open border, those have already all been met, and they're still refusing and going through these minor efforts. I mean, just third-party thing, which is, it essentially means you're going to have hippies and truck drivers. I mean, just imagine a border between like Sweden and Norway that only people from Bolivia can cross. So it's a bit of it's a bit of a nothing burger.
Backpackers and stuff. Yeah. I want to go through a few more countries in terms of the diplomatic sphere. I'm also interested in your opinion with regards to Israel. Armenia and Israel don't have really that deep relations, but recently Israel appointed a new ambassador who met with Pashinyan and said that he wants deepened relations. Israel's new prime minister Yair Lapid has been seen as more inclined to deepen relations with Armenia. However, in Armenia, Israel is seen as the country that supplied high quality weaponry and technology to Azerbaijan, which was used in the 2020 war. Should Israel be engaged with?
Oh, absolutely, it should be engaged with. That's not. I mean, you need to engage Israel for the purposes of engaging that country because it's an important country regionally, and obviously, Israel's supporters, the Jewish communities around the world, are very influential in most of the countries that they live in. So it's obviously you need to engage them. I'm skeptical about what you can change diplomatically or politically, because the relationship between the Aliyev regime and Israel is based on one thing, which is allowing the operations of the Israeli government against Iran to go through his country, which is a dangerous game to play. And if there's a serious confrontation, he'll pay a price for it. But so far, he's been the winner of that calculation, and Israel is not going to sacrifice that access to have a relationship with Armenia. That's just simply not going to happen. However, I think where you can actually do make breakthroughs is on the economic front. There are already multiple Israeli IT firms that have offices in Armenia. And there's actually a lot of back and forth with that, and also in the jewelry trade. So it's actually where you can create relationships is actually on the business front, and that can lead to other things, and also a scientific front. I think those are the two places you start. But I do not see any effort that anybody can make that can fundamentally undo the Aliyev relationship with Israel, because it's based on something that we cannot do, which is to become an antagonist of Iran.
And another area I think is very interesting is the Arab world. Pashinyan recently met and signed multiple agreements with the Qatari Emir in Doha. Overtures have started with Saudi Arabia. Armenia does not have diplomatic relations, official diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, but many believe this will change soon. How do you think the Arab world should be approached?
Oh, this is all very good. The Arab world, is the center of money, investment, many other things in not only regionally but worldwide. Specifically, the UAE, frankly, even more so than Saudi Arabia. So I think the engagement is a must, and I'm very glad that, for example, that the Prime Minister was in Qatar. I think these are all very good developments. This is also where culture comes into play. You know, Armenians actually have history in the Arab world of being the middle class business people who make the countries run, as far as from a commerce standpoint, whether it's in Lebanon, Syria, or there's a lot of Armenians in the UAE right now in Dubai. So I think there's a lot of goodwill that we can actually use. And I think what this really tells you is what we need is a serious, what I call the diplomacy of the peripheries, the politics of the peripheries, just because relationships regionally, locally are always problematic. You please one party and you displease another, because all of these countries that are neighbors to us have different relationships with the different countries. However, if you're creating relationships with the Argentinas and the Brazils and the Singapores and the Ethiopias of the world, there's no conflict, and you can actually deepen those relationships, because some of those countries can actually become very good trade partners, or in case of Singapore, very good examples. And it doesn't cause any problem. So I think that, and it also was one of the places where you can actually use the realities of the Armenian diaspora in places like Brazil and Argentina, where Armenia should have actually no business in. You can actually have significant relationship with, because they have significant and very wealthy Armenian communities. So I think it's very important. This is the first step into creating this diplomacy and the politics of peripheries that can actually allow this country to become much more relevant than its size would actually allow it, because it's this is where the Armenian nation comes into play, because we're an international people, actually.
There has been some criticism, however, of Armenia's diplomatic team. Many decry it as inexperienced. For example, Armenian Foreign Minister Arat Mirzoyan has little experience in the diplomatic sphere. The Deputy Speaker of Parliament, Ruben Rubinyan, who heads the Armenian side of the delegation to the Armenia-Turkey normalization process, similarly has little experience, especially compared to his Turkish counterpart, who is a veteran diplomat. Is this a problem in your mind? What do you think about these accusations of inexperience?
Well, they're true. Fundamentally, they're true, is because we have underinvested and not paid attention to creating a large, competent diplomatic corps. You know, we have a few outstanding stars here and there, but they're few in number. And the other side has actually invested a lot of money in creating a very successful diplomatic corps. So that they're actually true. But it's more of a structural issue than this person or that person. On the other hand, I think, given the fact that the primary job that diplomats do is to, tell a story about the country and at the same time create relationships, yes, there are many skills in becoming a diplomat, but I can tell you there are many business executives, for example, they'll make great diplomats that have never been diplomats before, because they know how to make a deal, they know how to talk to people, they know how to read people, most importantly, and understand what makes people tick. So I think one of the things we can actually do is to actually upgrade the diplomatic corps very quickly by employing a lot of people from different fields that aren't necessarily diplomats, because we just don't have that, we don't have a bench that's very strong at this point. So overall, those criticisms are valid in totality. But, for example, Arat Mirzoyan has actually done a better job than I thought he would. He's been far more aggressive than I thought he would, and they're actually making... And again, this is all relative. Obviously, we're in a gigantic geopolitical hole. You just have to look at it in relative terms. So the criticism is valid, but the criticism should be based on the systems of what we haven't done for 30 years. And then you have to look at how you fill the gaps.
And my final question is, what would your message be to Armenian diplomats around the world who are trying to further the Armenian cause? Understand the uniqueness of our story. Depending on where you're at, especially in the West, about how this country is an island of freedom and a sea of tyranny. In other parts of the world, you can talk about essentially the different conceptions of freedom that we have, which is actually closer to, it's not Western in brand or style. It's far more universal and much more relevant to people in this region. Talk about the economic prospects of the country, specifically in the IT sector. And if you're a competent Armenian ambassador at this point, you're actually promoting business. Right. Because the most important thing
the most important, beyond the immediate geopolitical problems that we have, the number one priority is economic growth. Because if a prosperous Armenia can actually turn the tables on many things. That's the number one priority of everyone. So it's economic development, telling a competent story about the country and our neighbors, and essentially having a message that matches with each of our audiences. But more often than not, it's just don't be lazy, be aggressive and do your job.
Well, Eric, insightful as always. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.